You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com. There you go. Welcome to the big show, my family and friends. I hope you have all your arms, legs, and members tucked in, whatever the announcer says at the beginning of the show. We're going to have a great show for you today, and I'm excited to hear from this author because I love political intrigue. I love political science. I love, what a little bit of democracy we may have left in the tank, and I guess I'm just going to have to enjoy watching it come down in flames at the point that it is. So we're going to be talking to an amazing, I don't know why I'm excited about that. Sounds horrible. 248 years and whatever. It was a nice run. We've got an amazing author on the show. He's the author of the latest book called The Fabulist, the lying, hustling, grifting, stealing, and very American legend of George Santos. It comes out November 28th, 2023. Mark Chiasano is on the show with us today. He will be talking about this interesting character who somehow got into Congress and is still there. I think that's what's interesting too as well. Before we get to that, be sure to refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, YouTube.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss one on the Tickety Talkity, and ChrisVossFacebook.com. Mark took it upon himself to cover George Santos as a columnist and editorial writer at New York's Newsday, Long Island's paper of record. As the youngest editorial writer in the paper's history, he interviewed national leaders like Hillary Clinton, Hakeem Jeffries, tracked and rode along with far-right patriot groups and fringe left activists, and traveled from New Hampshire to Puerto Rico to tell the story of American politics on the ground. He's also a New York City native and fiction writer whose story collection from Marine Park received a Penn Hemingway Award honorable mention. His writing has appeared in places like The Drift, McSweeney's, The Paris Review, The Atlantic, and more. Welcome to the show, Mark. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Thanks for coming. This should be an interesting show. A lot of interesting fun. Do I have to dress up like George Santos in Brazil to be in the show today?
There are lots of costumes. He jumps from one to another.
I feel like I should have came in drag for the show. Give us your .coms. Where do you want people to find you on the interwebs? Yeah,
I'm on Twitter, MJ Chiusano, CHIUSANO. But most importantly, the book comes out on Tuesday, and it's going to be a lot of fun. The Fabulist. I think that's what was fun for me about doing this book, was getting to just write about a kind of crazy character, a kind of catch me if you can story, really American story.
There you go.
That was fun. Yeah.
When we put out the pre-show promotion on this, I had people write me, you're having George Santos on? Because, the picture of the cover.
Wow. Oh, man.
George.
Okay.
And they're like, that's going to be an interesting show.
I was going to say, do I look like George Santos now?
No. Yeah. It's just, the big face is right on there. And the Fabulous kind of has, I don't know, it sounds like something he would write maybe in title.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, funnily enough, he, after he got indicted, he gave this kind of wild press conference, which maybe people have seen little snippets of, but he kind of railed at the system and the indictment and really kind of went off on everybody. And at the very end of it, he said, maybe this experience has been something for a book someday, something along those lines. So I do think he would love to write a book someday.
Yeah, send him a copy, see if you can get an autograph.
We'll see.
There you go. So give us a 30,000 overview of the book and what's inside.
So this is the story of an extremely American guy who, born in Queens, from what he called abject poverty, and he just had this ambition to be a wealthy man, a famous man, someone kind of who could become a celebrity. And that's who this guy was in the beginning. And lots of people feel that way, right? And the problem was that he got blocked on all levels. He was not able to make a ton of money on Wall Street. He was not able to go to one of the fancy colleges that he wanted to go to. So he started lying about it. And he lied kind of all the way up. And again, I think it's a kind of two-pronged story. On one level, it's this incredible story of this amazing grifter, kind of catch me if you can style thing. On the other hand, it's a story of an American political system that allowed a guy like that to flourish and thrive. And like you said, he's still in office as we speak.
Do you think that we see these copycats now of Trump, Kari Lake, him, all these other people? Do you think that Trump broke our system so much that this is the new flood of the American politician?
So what's interesting with Santos and Trump is that Santos really modeled himself after Trump in a lot of ways. He admired him, would sort of go try to hear him speak and hear his kind of, aides and stuff speak, very into Trump. And so he is in some ways a kind of mini Trump. See that in his political run. But what I find interesting is that, Trump is a little bit sui generis. He's a guy who had his own TV show. He was famous before he for office. He's not as wealthy as he says he is, but he's certainly a wealthy man, right?
Yeah.
So kind of no surprise that a guy like that could win the presidency, right? And we've seen it before with Reagan, etc. What's interesting is that Santos kind of followed the path without the wealth, power, or fame, right? And
why bother to skip it? Just lie about it, right?
Exactly. I think that is what is concerning about the American system, is that now it seems it's been so broken that it allows a kind of common grifter, someone without fame and power to ascend.
Yeah. So how did you tell us a little bit about your life story, because people like to get to know the author as well. Yeah. What was your upbringing and how did you get stuck with this from did your editor just say you're in charge of this now? Or did
Right. I grew up in Brooklyn, born and raised, still live here. And, so it's a similar kind of outer borough in a way, upbringing to Santos. Santos grew up in Queens and not the parts that are kind of fanciest or anything like that. So I did have a sort of sense of the world that Santos came up in. I had been writing for Newsday for a long time, both in the city. I was covering New York City politics for a long time, then went out to the island and was writing about COVID, the pandemic, and congressional politics. So this was, I guess, my third or fourth cycle covering congressional politics out there. And, this is a race. A guy named Tom Suozzi is the Democratic incumbent, probably going to win again. And then suddenly this sort of random person says, I'm going to run for office. So yeah, basically my editor came to my desk and said, hey, we did this little newsletter about New York politics. And so my editor said, can you write a quick little intro about this person running for office? I said, sure, no problem. Let me get the phone number. I'll give him a call. And I write about this in the book. It's kind of a fun story. I call him up, and usually it's kind of hard to reach candidates, they're busy, whatever. But he picks up really quickly. He's eager to talk. And I say, hi, sir, whatever. When are you launching your campaign? And he says, oh, I'm launching it today. Great. Oh, wow. Okay. Can I come see it? Where is it? Oh, no, I'm actually in Florida right now, he says. And so this is a guy, a reminder, again, he's running in New York, so really far away, but he's in Florida on business on the day he's launching his campaign. So this was like my sort of meeting with him in this kind of weird way.
Mm-hmm. And so you get into it with him and you start basically running the report on him. So how soon do you start identifying that something's wrong?
I mean, that was the sort of immediate strangeness, right? That's a very uncommon way to launch a campaign. But there were kind of other strangenesses that came soon after that, right? Not too long after that, we noticed that the address he was using, that's, where he said he lived in sort of campaign finance documents, seemed to not be in the district, right? And then he was very unclear on where exactly he was living, which again is a strange thing. Usually you want to say, I'm running for office, I come from this neighborhood. But he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't be pinned down. So I was writing a lot about these little weirdnesses. He had a very strange recount campaign committee that he was fundraising basically for a race he'd already lost in that first year. He also had sort of retweeted some QAnon slogans and said he actually didn't know what they were. So I did a lot about that. And the first race, we knew he was going to lose. he seems to know he was going to lose too. And he did lose significantly by like 12 percentage points. But this was another weird thing. Then he claimed, oh, actually I won, just because he won on election night, that the number of people who'd voted on election day. This was this kind of the red mirage thing that happened all during 2020. But we knew he was losing by a ton because there were so many absentee ballots out. He sort of pretends he won, and he goes down to Washington for freshman orientation, which was kind of crazy. So silly. We knew he'd lost,
He actually showed up
Yeah.
He wasn't like Carrie Lake, where she's just like, did Carrie Lake try and show up? I don't know.
I'm trying to remember. I'd
be surprised if she did actually come.
I kind of think he fundraised a bit for her while he was down there. He was trying to fundraise. Yeah. But he had all these strange things going on from the very beginning.
Wow. And so you document all this stuff. How many times have you talked to him as you did you reach out to him to interview him for the book and stuff?
I did. I tried to reach out to him a number of times. He basically ignored me. Then one day I called from a different phone number and he picked up with that phone, I guess by accident. And, once he realized who it was, he kind of, ribbed me for a little bit, and then he hung up. And then he called me back immediately to just kind of yell at me some more. And, you can read about that in the book. It's a fun scene of him sort of going back and forth with me just to kind of threaten me and say, if you get anything wrong.
Threaten the reporter. There you go.
Yeah.
That's always
as if I wasn't going to write the book.
You're like, yeah.
So he basically
maybe he was just busy with all of his babies. I'm sorry to interrupt you there.
A lot of babies. Yeah, he's fun carrying the babies around. Yeah, he did not want me writing the book, I guess, but he ultimately basically just explained that he was not going to participate at all. So I left him alone after that.
There you go. So tell us about some of the tidbits that stick out in here. Evidently, early on, he's stealing money from his Aunt Elma.
Yeah. I mean, the fun thing in this book was I got to go through all the really crazy, lurid stories that everyone kind of knows about him, and I got to kind of dig into them a little more. There's a lot of fun stuff about his volleyball non-history and his family Jewish history, which I actually kind of learned a little more about in the book than, we kind of knew in the first place. But it has all of that fun stuff. But then, this is what's great about Santos, is that he had so many lies and so many hustles and schemes that I was able to find some fun new ones. So one was that, he seems to have stolen from his Aunt Elma, who is this woman who doted on him from a young age. She came from Brazil, like his mother and father, worked really hard to build a life in America. And he essentially seems to have stolen from her. And, they have some sort of relationship even after that. She was the one, along with his father, who kind of put themselves on the financial line to keep him out of jail. So in the present, she's the one who, they didn't actually have to put money forward, but they're on the line for his bond, which I think is a very sort of heart-wrenching experience. This is an older woman who you've stolen from, and she's the one keeping you out of jail.
Well, his family still loves him, evidently. I've known people like him that are, would you call him narcissistic? Would you call him, is he just a hustler grifter of Fabulous?
He's definitely, he seems to be a hustler. He makes everything up. What's fun in a book like this is, I try to just get into what's in his head, what drives him. And I try not to worry too much about labels. But one that some people floated to me was pseudologio fantastica, which is a kind of condition where, you sort of believe your own lies. It's like you're getting even deeper into it than someone who's just kind of lying for personal gain. It's a step beyond that. And so I do, it could be something like that. It does seem compulsive with him. He lies when he doesn't seem to need to.
You don't need to lead. You just do it for the game of it.
Yeah.
I've had two friends that were like that, and we probably had that condition, and fairly narcissistic, but they had built a lifetime of just this stack of lies and cards, and one lie was built on the other, and the lie was so big, and they would have to constantly tell you all the lies to try and gaslight you or program you.
Wow.
And if you could try and, attack one of the cards and go, okay, this is clearly bullshit. Can you just quit telling me this story? Because this story is bullshit. You're lying. The problem is they couldn't take it down because everything was so intertwined.
Wow.
And you would sit and look at them and go, my God, you're like, half the reason you have to tell your lies every day is because you're trying to remember them all because they're so goddamn complex and they're stacked one on top of each other. If someone were to like sit you down and disprove all your lies to your face and you were accepting of it, I don't know what you do. You either go into depression, a funny farm, or jump off a cliff.
A funny thing that I looked into some of the psychological research when I was doing this book, and I was curious about the idea of how do you find out if someone's lying, right? Mm-hmm. And it turns out that scientifically, it's not so easy, and we don't necessarily, the people that we think might be good at it aren't necessarily that great. So there's this incredible study of police officers trying to compare police officers figuring out a lie to just like a random college student. And there's not much difference. A police officer didn't end up being that much better in this sort of study.
Wow.
And I think one reason is that it's not obvious when someone's lying, and the things that work are hard to do. They're very physical. So the things that seem to work rely on how much energy it takes mentally to kind of keep a lie up in the air, kind of like what you're saying. Yeah. So because you're expending all that energy, if I come to you, if you're lying to me, and I sort of say, well, hold on a second, can you just tell me that story backwards? That's the kind of thing that trips up a serious liar. And so if you don't have that, if you don't have someone who's kind of pressing you, asking questions, it is pretty easy to kind of slide by.
and he does that. It's just incredible. And when you're telling so many lies, I imagine it's the same thing that Trump does to the news. For a long time, journalists really struggled with Trump because it was so overwhelming and the lies were racking up so fast. When you try to address one lie, you'd be like, wait, he told 20 more and this one's big over here. So let's go over there. And it's such a shit show fan of shit coming at you that, trying to figure out which one to address is, what was it like? Didn't the Washington Post and New York Times had the count where they counted how many lies Trump told?
It was hundreds, right?
Yeah. It was insane.
And I do think it's something like that went on here with Santos, where he was telling so many lies, and he had so many, not even just the lies, but he had so many kind of weird things about his background and his campaign that people were writing about it. Like I was an editorial writer at Newsday, and I was writing some things. The Daily Beast was writing some things. This place, the North Shore Leader. There were some people who were poking holes in his story, but there were so many holes that we almost didn't realize that everything was a hole, and so we, there was kind of this sense that he's crazy enough. We understand his craziness, but we didn't know the half of it, right? It was actually way deeper than we thought.
I mean, when you're lying about so much stuff that, it's you're like, well, I don't know, man. There's a lot of lies and stuff there, and where do we go? Somehow, how does he get over the threshold with the voters? Is it just charisma, likability?
He had a couple things going for him. So this was 2022, right? That's when he wins. And by that time in New York, there was a real red wave that had been building for a couple of years. So to give people an example, like everyone knows Chuck Schumer, right? Super powerful Senate Democrat. In New York, he's kind of even more powerful than he seems on the national sphere in a way, because he's a super good, local campaigner. He shows up everywhere. I think he spoke at 2 of my graduations over time in Brooklyn. Wow. He just speaks at every graduation. He's there, super attentive to district issues. Schumer lost Santos's district. Okay. So this is a guy who won easily New York statewide, but things were so Republican leaning in that district, that cycle, that he lost. So that's kind of like every Democrat was killed in Santos's neck of the woods. So it was a little bit like anyone who was Republican was going to win there. That was a piece of it. But also Santos kind of was able to ride that red wave even better than the normal Republican, because he was super willing to just say, whatever the voters wanted to hear, to really embrace these social issues that were percolating at the time, in ways that others, might have felt a little weird about, like they didn't want to flip-flop. He didn't care about flip-flopping. He would say whatever he needed to say.
Whatever he needed to say to get elected. Welcome to American politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess one of the failures is, my understanding is, or I just heard it kicked around, was that whoever was going up against him from the Democrat side really failed at doing oppo research on the guy or something.
So yeah, I write about this in the book, this process of how you gather the opposition research. So it's usually done by, the first version of it is done by the DCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. It's like this arm that helps congressional candidates. And the funny thing actually is, you can look up their document. It's public, it's pretty, it has a lot of really damning stuff about Santos in it. It's, dozens of pages long. It has the beginnings of his sketchy pet charity, which is not actually a charity, but, people probably know that story, right? That was found early on, and so they had a lot of things. And I think it's a little bit of what you said earlier, like the Trump thing. There was just so much wacky stuff that they found about him that they kind of thought this was enough, Yeah. The problem was they didn't find the sort of, in the same way that, I didn't find and the rest of the media didn't find the top primo wild things like him lying about his college degrees and his check fraud case in Brazil. Those are the things that were missed, and I think that would have helped people kind of connect the dots.
There's the old thing about how when we move from radio to TV, that the most charismatic presidential candidate or politician usually wins. I don't know if it's true on smaller cases, but I know that that's kind of the method we use for the president. Like the people who heard Nixon versus JFK on the radio thought Nixon won, but the people who watched TV were like, they saw the charisma of John F. Kennedy and he won. And ever since then, you can really look at each presidential race mano a mano, and really the most charismatic guy wins. Even like George Bush Sr. wasn't that charismatic. I mean, he was against a sleeper. Who was it? It wasn't Bob Dole. It was it Mondale or Dukakis?
Yeah.
I think Dukakis went down with the affair, didn't he? Wasn't that? No. I got him all mixed up, don't I? Whoever it was a sleeper.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. I think there's one element of that that's totally true. You're right that he is very charismatic, and that's something that everyone told me. I mean, I have this fun story in my book about him going out and ordering $200 bottles of wine. Like he's that kind of guy. He's very gregarious. He's fun to be with. So he's super charismatic, and that helped him when he was running. But I think there's kind of a deeper thing in what you were saying about the shifting of technologies, right? So we saw that with radio to TV. And I think now we're seeing that again from maybe sort of TV to this cord cutting media universe with like podcasts, for example, or just, social media, right? Which has a lot of benefits, right? This podcast is great. But there's also a lot of ways that, disinformation can spread if there's just so much information out there, right? Yeah. And I think Santos is a candidate who benefited from that shift, that technological shift.
Yeah.
He's very good on podcasts, by the way.
I've met people who base their whole sort of outlook on politics from memes on TikTok.
Yeah,
and that's all they know. And there's a whole nother show for AI and what that might do to our future election. So you mentioned the Brazil thing. This is pretty interesting. You go down to Brazil and you track down the people who remember him as a drag queen. That's why I was doing the joke earlier, folks, if you didn't catch it, about showing up in drag for the show. Tell us about what that goes on.
Oh, yeah.
With all of that bit.
That was one of my favorite parts of reporting this book, was getting to go down to Brazil and spend some time there and find people who knew him. When I started doing the book, there's a ton of lack of clarity about Santos. We didn't even really know exactly when he was in Brazil. We knew, the listeners probably seen the famous pictures of him wearing that kind of red dress. Like, we knew he had been in Brazil and dressed in drag, but it was a little unclear on when. And what I learned was that he had basically, he kind of went back and forth. He had family there. And this is kind of a typical modern immigrant story, right? That people do go back and forth. He seems to have been born in New York. He was born in New York, as far as we know. But he, in his late teenage years, he was spending a lot of time with family in Brazil. And he had this kind of flourishing moment where he kind of could be whoever he wanted to be. He was known, but he wasn't that well known. Everyone didn't know, they couldn't peg him, they couldn't fit him into a box. Mm-hmm. And he used that to his advantage. He started, experimenting, dressing in drag, performing to some extent, and trying to perform more than he probably did. And so when I was down there, the really fun thing I did, there's only a couple of pictures and videos of him dressing in drag. Yeah. And he has used that to his advantage, because he says, hey, this was just like I didn't do this much. Like, I had danced at a festival.
I did it for Halloween or something.
Right. Which does not seem to be true. Certainly that's not what people told me when I was down there. Yeah. But, we don't really know what it was like when he performed. So what I did was I convinced his drag mentor to kind of welcome me into her home, and we spent a lot of time together here. I just heard about Santos and their life down there. And then the great thing was that this mentor said, look, I don't perform much, but I'm performing on Friday night. I'm going to do the things that Santos kind of learned from me, and you can watch it, right? So basically I got to see Santos, what Santos was learning from, what was that, like 20 years ago? A little less than 20. And so I go to this club. It's called a sauna. No women are allowed in. I actually went
at all?
No, not allowed in, or people who appear to be women in street clothes, right? Because there is a lot of drag dressing. And we know that because I went with my wife, who's also a reporter, and she was down there with me. We were just going to kind of go together. We thought it would be fun to see it, and they wouldn't let her in. They kind of stopped her at the door.
Wow.
Yeah. So I go in alone, and it's a place where you can buy sex, where you can, they give you a key actually when you go in, and you can, it opens up a door and you can bring someone in the door with you and have sex. And so I did not do that, but I did go and see the performance. And it's interesting because there's a bunch of performers, and some of it is very risque. It's basically like stripping, but then Santos's drag mentor comes on stage, and she's beautiful. She's wearing a dress, and she goes by she in her performing, her performance name is Aola Rochard. And it's not a sort of risque strip thing. It's like this kind of beautiful celebration of femininity. And she's wearing a dress, and she's lip syncing and dancing. Anyway, I think this is the kind of drag that Santos embraced when he was a teenager.
I had a flash in my head when you said it of George Santos doing a strip tease, and I was like, oh my God, I'm going to barf. You talk in the book about how I'm trying to get that image out of my head.
Sorry. Yeah.
I have to drink bleach later. But you talk about how he was doing Ozempic, liposuction, lip injections, lap band surgery, all these things to try and sculpt his body. And I imagine he used some of the illicit funds from his things to. I don't know if you saw recently. Do you see him in those skinny pants or something he's wearing that look painfully? Painful to wear? Yeah,
he's always wearing. It's funny, I talked to over 100 people who knew him for this book, and a lot of them told me he always looks different. You'd see him a few months later, and he looked a little different. He's wearing some slightly different clothes. He does have this ability to kind of change, or he seems to want to change his body and his looks. And you're right. This just came out. I wrote a ton about this in my book, that he's sculpting his body, he's using Botox, liposuction, etc. But we did just learn that he seems to have been using campaign money to do his Botox. That's the evidence from this House Ethics report.
And it looks like for those people who are listening to this 10 years from now, we're at the point right now where, correct me if I'm wrong, he survived one expulsion vote, but now the House Ethics vote is out. He has 2 rounds of multiple charges from the Justice Department, and God knows how much more as they dig through it. And we may be going to another vote maybe next week or something.
He actually survived 2 expulsion votes, technically. So this is number 3. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it looks like that report is maybe going to be the sinking ship for him.
That's what people are saying who are, in Congress or hearing from people in Congress. And the evidence for that is that lots of members of Congress who before the report said, look, let's give him a chance, due process. Now they're kind of switching over and saying it's time for this guy to go.
And evidently one of the broken things about them, between McCarthy and the new Kevin Johnson, is that they need his vote, so they put up with him, which is a real stained albatross, I think, for Republicans to have, this guy. And I think his constituents hate him for the most part. Is there anybody in his constituency that's, yeah, I'm fine with it?
It's a great question. I mean, this sort of truism in politics is the only poll that matters is election day,
Yeah, that's true.
I think it's true. If he was actually on the ballot, if he is on the ballot, we would see how many people still support him. I do think there's an element in the district, just like in America in general, that doesn't mind. They see him as kind of funny on one level and also kind of railroaded by the establishment on the other.
Wow.
So I don't think he has zero friends, but he's lost a lot of friends over time, for sure.
It's interesting how voters can see through his bullshit and lies, but they can't see through Trump's.
Yeah. There's I sort of grapple with this question a little bit in the book because he is sort of the obvious one. He's the one that is like providing cover for other Republicans who are doing sort of shameless things. In the book, I call them a kind of shamelessness caucus, the kind of politician who is there mostly to, get sort of, advance themselves, not do so much political work. And he is in that, he's of that, of course, but he's so much zanier and funnier than even Marjorie Taylor Greene or like Lauren Boebert or something, who also do crazy, shameless things just to get attention. And so I think that his actions sort of give them a little bit of space. They can be shameless in a slightly less shameless way.
Do you think our problem in politics is we've devolved to a point where we've basically taken and turned politics into the Kim Kardashians? Like, we've gone from the Kardashians and the shit show that all of that is, and the spectacle and the horror show, what that is, if you have any seriousness. And we basically just transposed it right over to politics. Is that where we're going? Is that the train we're on?
I think so. I mean, what I love about American politics is kind of how cyclical it is. And we've seen this show before in some ways, right? I mean, Reagan was seen as kind of, to some level, in some ways, an unserious person who was an actor before he was an elected official, right? That being said, I do think that one thing that changes is the technology and kind of the technological moment we live in. And Reagan, in some ways, was way more serious than some of these politicians now who have no background in policy or really interest in policy either. Yeah. It's really just about their own celebrity that they're kind of pushing. And Santos is kind of the perfect symbol for that because he loves reality TV. He loves like Bethany Frankel, Real Housewives. This is what got him into politics in the first place.
Yeah. I was listening to, I think it was somebody on MSNBC's Morning Joe said it, but they said one of the problems with the small donor thing and the performative candidates that we have, like MTG, who's the guy in Florida who got
Paul Gosar, maybe.
Paul Gosar to the other guy, Matt Gaetz. That whole little crowd that goes on. They don't do any legislation. They just do this performative thing. When the mics are on, they pull some sort of stunt. Evidently, they're fairly behaved when the mics are off. And someone said one of the problems is the small donations that come in. And that's actually one of our biggest problems. And it used to be everyone thought, well, small donor is good because it's from the people. It's not, it's not the Citizens United, buy your own SCOTUS person. But they surmise that one of the problems is that Matt Gaetz and MTG and these other people have tuned in that when they do performative stunts, they can send out things to all their individual donors and they'll get this money, which is for the vast part, the crazies, like the people who are really fucking out there. And maybe somebody should, I don't know how you map something like this out or study it, but he said that's the problem. He can get these crazies who will send them all sorts of money over any crazy stunt he does, and they're just basically buying stunts. It's like buy your own
interesting. I would take that anecdote and frame it slightly differently. I agree with you that a lot of these shameless politicians are being shameless in order to put up something on social media and raise money off it, for sure. But I think the problem with that is how nationalized our politics has become. And so you as a person running for Congress, you do not necessarily need to build sort of kind of support from your community. You don't really even need to know your local issues that well. What you do is you just be shameless on these national issues, important issues, obviously, but issues that there is no compromising on. You're not going to convince anyone on abortion or immigration or something like that. And so our politics has become so nationalized that that's how you raise your money. And that's a shame, because it's actually, if you are focused on local things, you can really, compromise, and there's more bipartisan agreement to be found on these lower level things that actually affect everyone's life in a big way. And, the fact that various institutions have been broken and things have gotten so nationalized, that kind of leads to this even more performativeness, I think.
Crazy. And so they just perform and put on the show and then, send out a, hey, send me some money. Somebody should look into that if it's true. I thought it was really interesting. Someone said that, and they're like, yeah, the Matt Gaetz of the world, all the crazies will send in the money, and it's basically performative, higher stunts. A lot of these people just they have the sort of things that Matt Gaetz says, the C-band is they just want to burn it all down. They think that somehow that would be good for everyone if you burn out the government. And that actually doesn't end well if you study history.
Yeah, not ideal.
It doesn't end well for everyone. But, there you go. Any final teasers or thoughts you want to shoot out as to tease us about the book as we go out?
I think that what's so fun about this book is how compulsive Santos is about hustling. So it's kind of like every couple of pages, there's a new hustle. One of my favorites is the way he's scamming this 16-year-old kid, friend of his family, friend of his sister's actually, who's living with them, doesn't speak any English, also an immigrant from Brazil, looks up to Santos as a kind of brother figure, and Santos scams him for the last couple of $100 he has left. So this is kind of what this story is built on before he gets to Congress.
Just shameless, man. There you go. Well, you've got a whole second book coming up if you want, for all the more adventures, I'm sure, especially if he doesn't get expulsed from Congress. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be more performative stuff. So
you picked the
winner horse for writing some books on.
Yeah, I know. We'll see what's next.
There you go. You build a whole career on it. You just call yourself who was it? Bernstein and Woodward and Bernstein. Just call yourself the Woodward and Bernstein.
There you go.
Of George Santos. Thank you very much for coming to the show, Mark. Give us your .coms. Where can people find you on the interwebs?
MJ Chisano at Twitter, and the book is called The Fabulist. It's out on Tuesday.
There you go. And you just lie and tell people it's endorsed by George.
It does have a blurb on the back from George making fun of me. So
does it really?
That. Yeah.
Well, that's an endorsement, I think, in some way, shape, or form. So there you go. And his face is on the cover. I'm surprised that he wouldn't be at least proud of that. Of course, it does say liar in the little sort of matrix print on the front
That's
of it.
Right. That's right. Really cool. He's not going to be happy about that.
There you go. Thank you very much for coming to the show, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
There you go. And thanks so much for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss, Facebook.com, and all those other crazy places on the internet. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time. And that should have us out. That was